Hello, friends. I'm Ryan Shaw. I work at Arizona State University, and prior to this, for a long while, I was a cavalry officer and strategist in the United States Army. I've been asked to provide an American perspective on this idea of integrated deterrence. Obviously, I don't speak for all of America, but I'll do my best, and I'm grateful for the opportunity. This term was first introduced into our lexicon by the U.S. National Defense Strategy, the classified version of which was published in March of 2022, the unclassified version in October, and then the National Security Strategy, which also came out in late 22. Now, we in America, we love a good bumper sticker, and integrated deterrence is a pretty good one. When you're in government, civilian or uniformed, it's because you know you can stamp that label on whatever pet project you had in mind, however tenuously related, and you'll greatly increase your odds of getting it funded. When you're out of government, it's great clickbait for articles and papers, conferences and proposals, whether you're arguing in support of the concept or criticizing it. And lest you think I'm being overly cynical here, I should confess that I think by now I'm guilty of both counts. But what is actually meant by this slogan? What is integrated deterrence? Well, there are two words here, and we can define them both. Let's take the noun first before the adjective, because that probably makes sense grammatically, and also because deterrence had a long and robust theoretical history before we appended this new modifier. I know this definitional exercise will be a review for most of us, but look, in light of the end of that holiday from history that Professor Stockings mentioned, I really think it's worth looking at these old ideas with fresh eyes. I first encountered these concepts as a cadet in the late 90s, during that unipolar moment after the Cold War. I saw them again in grad school and at the War College in the late aughts and the early teens, during the height of the War on Terror and the peak of our obsession with counterinsurgency. But I have to say, they take on an entirely new meaning and urgency when I think about them now in this era of strategic competition with near-peer adversaries. So, according to our doctrine, deterrence is the prevention of action by the existence of a credible threat of unacceptable counteraction and or belief that the cost of action outweighs the perceived benefits. Our theory says it's one of the four basic uses of military force, which are to assure, deter, coerce, and compel. Both morally and practically, deterrence is by far the preferred use because, well, nobody dies. And as has been often said in our ongoing budget debates, however high the costs of preventing a war, they're almost certainly lower than the costs of fighting one. Deterrence is about maintaining the status quo. And I hope we can agree that in light of the other concepts for world order currently on offer, the rules-based liberal democratic order that has prevailed for the last 70 years is well worth maintaining. Deterrence is about influencing the cost-benefit calculus that goes on in the mind of the adversary. It takes two forms. There is deterrence by punishment and deterrence by denial. These are easiest, for me anyway, to consider in terms of single combat, or maybe a bar fight if you're into that sort of thing. Deterrence by punishment says, don't hit me, because if you do, I'll hit you back so hard, you'll regret it. And denial says, don't hit me, because you can't hurt me. As you'd expect, these two broad concepts can be, and have been, parsed into a zillion arcane subcategories, most of which are not relevant here. But it is worth breaking down denial into denial by prevention, which says, don't try to hit me because I have years of training and cat-like reflexes and I can block or dodge any punch you can throw. And denial by resilience, which says, I'm tough as nails, I've got an iron jaw, and I can take the best you've got and it won't even faze me. So in military terms, to use the classic Cold War nuclear examples, punishment means planting in the mind of our adversary the idea that if they strike us, we will counterstrike at a level they're not willing to risk. If they launch one warhead, we'll launch 5. Denial means planting the idea that if they strike us, it won't work, either because we can, say, shoot down their missiles in flight, or because we have duplicated and distributed our capabilities such that no one strike of theirs can have a strategic effect. Simple enough. But two further points about deterrence. Number one, the literature often discusses the idea that deterrence is some function of capability and will. In other words, you actually have to be able to punish or deny. That's mostly a physics problem. But you also have to have the will to use those capabilities. And that's mostly a moral problem. We have long enjoyed an undeniable advantage in capabilities. It's eroded in recent years, but we still have it. So if we have failed to deter, say, Russia from invading Ukraine, it's because for reasons that should be pretty plain, that particular adversary was willing to gamble that we did not have the will. So deterrence is a function of capability and will, but it's less often noted that it's also an exercise in communication. Even if you have both the capability and the will, deterrence will fail if your adversary doesn't believe that you do. In that case, he might be surprised when he loses the war, but it will have been a war nonetheless. And as we all know, war is hell. So that would be a deterrence failure based on a communication failure. Also implied here is the idea that you could lack the capability or the will, but somehow make your enemy believe that you have it. Theoretically possible, but it's a real gamble. And at the strategic level, I don't think it's one any of us are willing to entertain. The second point is about the state of the field. I will shamefacedly confess that just to refresh my memory on some of these things, I skimmed the Wikipedia entry for deterrence theory, and I came across this line. Most of the innovative work on deterrence theory occurred from the late 1940s to the mid-1960s. Now, that might not be fair to my colleague, Wynne Bowen, and others who are thinking hard about deterrence today. But there is some truth there, and it's high time for a refresh in the field, both because the stakes are high as great power competition heats up, and also because the current situation presents many complicating dimensions that didn't exist in the 20th century, new technologies and new domains of conflict. So if the NDS does nothing else, it will have made a great contribution if it kicks off a renaissance in deterrence thinking akin to that of the early Cold War. And that brings us to this modifying adjective, integrated. What do we mean when we propose to make integrated deterrence our aim? The term was announced by the Pentagon before it was defined in the NDS, which gave rise to several months of speculation. I engaged in some of that too. In November of 21, I wrote that an integrated deterrence worth its name would be integrated both vertically and horizontally. Vertically, it would supplement our nuclear and conventional deterrence with unconventional deterrence to provide creative and seamless response options other than do nothing and all-out war. Horizontally, along with allies and partners, it would integrate military force with the other instruments of U.S. national power. So vertically, at the high end, if you will, nuclear deterrence is arcane and complex, but it's a well-developed field. Everyone knows about it, but only a few really understand it. It's a niche concern on both the theoretical side and in its implementation. Those of us who are not in that niche understand the stakes, and we just really hope that the experts know what they're doing. Conventional deterrence is more straightforward, but even that's getting complicated by these new technologies we're discussing, such as hypersonics, AI, cyber and quantum, autonomous and swarm platforms, and others. And at the low end, there's this emerging concept of irregular deterrence, which has primarily to do with the gray zone and malign activities below the threshold of military conflict. Early in the Cold War, George Kennan wrote that Americans were handicapped by a popular attachment to the concept of a basic difference between peace and war. And I fear that's still true today. It's an oversimplification, but not by much, to say that our options are still largely binary. It's either war or it's not war. But we know that our adversaries are not similarly constrained. So this, to my mind, is a, if not the, significant challenge for deterrence thinking in our era. How does punishment work when attribution is difficult, as it often is in the cyber domain or when proxies are employed? How do we calculate proportionality? Must we respond in the same domain, or is it appropriate to respond with a different instrument of national power? And how do we manage escalation? How do we build resilience against malign, non-kinetic activities for ourselves and our allies? And how do we balance the investments required to do that with the costs required to modernize our nuclear and conventional forces? We've got to find answers to these questions, and we also have to integrate those answers into a seamless deterrence concept so we have integrated, coherent, complementary, and effective deterrence at every point on the continuum, from everyday competition through large-scale combat. And of course, this is impossible without that horizontal integration, with allies and partners on the one hand, and across all the instruments of national power. It's ironic in a way that, at least from the US perspective, the first part, allies and partners, is often easier than the second part, integrating across our interagency and across the sectors of our own society. It's easier to integrate externally with others than internally with ourselves. Of course, we've been working to integrate our defense concepts with allies for generations now. And while never perfect, we've had some pretty great success. Americans fought both world wars, Korea and Vietnam, as part of a coalition. That's also true for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I'm well aware that Australians were shoulder to shoulder with us in every one of those conflicts. NORAD, our binational command with Canada, is the premier example for homeland defense, and NATO is the enduring example in Europe. Both have had great effects in terms of strategic deterrence. We have a network of alliances in the Pacific as well. And of course, the most recent example, and most germane for our purposes again, is AUKUS, where we've heard all three allies call for moving beyond interoperability to true interchangeability. So integrated deterrence is a call to do more of that and better. But I'd offer that I think we're well on our way. Internally, paradoxically, it's a lot more difficult. If we failed to achieve our strategic aims in the last few decades, and it seems undeniable that we have, it's not for a lack of military capability or for a lack of integration with allies. Again, we've had great support from our allies at every turn, and we've rarely suffered a battlefield defeat. I'd argue, and I think I'm in good company here, that it's primarily due to our inability to integrate that military instrument with the other instruments of national power, our diplomacy, development, our economic policies. That's the fundamental idea behind the competitive statecraft initiative we've just launched here at ASU. And I think that's the greatest challenge presented by this concept of integrated deterrence. There are lots of reasons why this is true, and exploring them all here would take far more time than I've been allotted. So that was my initial take on integrated deterrence, and it seems to be fairly well aligned with what actually came out in the National Defense Strategy, which says that integrated deterrence means using every tool at the department's disposal in close collaboration with our counterparts across the US government and with allies and partners to ensure that potential foes understand the folly of aggression. It says further that integrated deterrence is how we will align the department's policies, investments, and activities to sustain and strengthen deterrence, tailored to specific competitors and coordinated to maximum effect inside and outside the department. So that sounds great. Who could object? As General McMaster said at one of our recent events, raise your hand if you're in favor of disintegrated deterrence. But a catchy term and an announcement of your good intentions doesn't make it happen. And the most common criticism of the NDS is that it doesn't say much about how we're going to overcome the barriers that have prevented us from integrating our deterrence thus far. But to be fair, maybe that's asking too much of a strategy at that high level. So I recently checked in with folks I know across DoD and the interagency, and I asked how integrated deterrence was manifesting in their areas of responsibility since the publication of this strategic guidance. Were they seeing any new resources, new authorities? Did they see the strategies as just high-level statements of intent, the implementation of which they're meant to figure out on their own? Or are they actually just dead letters with business carrying on much as before? It's budget season in the United States, and from South Command and Africa Command, I was pointed to new funding requests of $200 million for those theaters under the label of integrated deterrence. That might be an example of what I said earlier, relabeling something you're going to do anyway to capitalize on the zeitgeist. But money is money either way, and it all spins the same. I didn't hear that from UCOM or Indo-PACOM, but then they already have special budget buckets for their priority projects, which were already labeled, aptly, we hope, the European Deterrence Initiative and the Pacific Deterrence Initiative. In the Pacific Theater, as we've said, AUKUS is the prime example of our commitment to integrating our deterrence efforts with our closest allies. It's easy to understand how a shared and distributed nuclear submarine capability impacts our collective capacity for deterrence by punishment and deterrence by denial through both prevention and resilience. And AUKUS is more than subs, of course. What will become of the defense capabilities contemplated by AUKUS's second pillar is yet to be seen. But in any case, as I've argued elsewhere, shared defense capabilities can only be effective when they're supported by shared doctrine and shared concepts, and ultimately shared war plans and exercises. So there's much work ahead if we're going to deliver on the promise of AUKUS. And I'm very much looking forward to working with colleagues to see how ASU, King's, and UNSW can partner toward that end through Security and Defense Plus. In terms of integrating allies and partners beyond AUKUS, a friend at Indo-PACOM pointed out that whatever help or motivation they're getting from Washington, it pales in comparison to what they're getting from the Chinese Communist Party. Largely speaking, the more the Chinese try to alter the world order, the more appealing the current order seems to those who might previously have taken it for granted. But of course, it would be unwise to rely on that too heavily or for too long. Contacts in the Foreign Service indicate that they have integrating initiatives that were already underway and slowly gaining momentum before the national security strategy, but that the endorsement from the White House and even the Pentagon's push with the NDS has given them new energy. So the bumper stickers, it seems, have their place after all. But I nevertheless do believe that it's here in the effort to break down our own internal bureaucratic barriers to integration that the United States faces its greatest challenge. And of course, as my State Department contact points out, these ideas are not new. We've known about these pathologies forever, and there have been no shortage over the years of good ideas and sincere attempts to fix them. We can only hope that the current set of global challenges and the recent strategic guidance have brought them into sharper focus, and that the time has finally come when we can make much needed progress and break through to a new era of competitive statecraft for America and our allies. I do believe that the fate of the free world depends on it. So in that regard, thank you for your service and for your own efforts, and I hope that this has been helpful. Thanks.